traffic jam on I-73, which is crazy.
There's never traffic on I-73.
I
I
can hear it, but I don't ever see traffic on I-73.
think that's a gigantic fib. We're gonna have to call
He
him
said
out.
there's an accident or something. We'll go over the agenda, introduce our fill-in, and then we will talk about the minutes. So the agenda, we'll do the minutes.
What? Sorry, Andrew's face.
One.
I'll have a quick discussion on some future meetings. We'll talk about policy area 2 and hopefully approve the draft so we can move forward, and then hopefully wrap up 3 and maybe jump into 4 and then talk about what's next. Does look like it's a little less crowded than it has been. So first, is everyone okay with that agenda? Okay. What about the minutes from the 11-2 meeting? Do we have
One
a
little tiny thing on the others in terms of the meeting. But we did include Jesse Day. He's included down in the body.
Thank you. Well, I'll let that, it's in one of his.
Okay, so other than adding Jesse Day, are there any other changes that anyone wants to the minutes from the last meeting?
So
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, am I gonna be the only one?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Kathy Rooney and I'm on the zoning board. Dick Fulner is not here tonight, so I am taking his place as the liaison to the zoning board.
You don't know any of these people, do you?
Some of them I do, but some of them I don't. I wouldn't mind a round of introductions.
Okay, should we start on this?
Let's do it.
Very,
all the way.
there you go.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Do you want to start? She just wants to, a quick introduction.
I'm Carolyn Bonds. Priscilla Olnick.
Jeff Lividay.
Terry.
Andrew Broom.
I'm Bill McNeil, facilitating.
John O'Day.
Yeah. Church Brown.
Amber Best.
Jason Webster.
Deborah Bullmazer. Lily Hopper O'Shea.
And Jerry Brown.
Okay, so we will go into the discussion. Oh, sorry, we have to do the secretary. So would anyone like to volunteer? Who has already been secretary, because we can't pick them?
Dick Fuller said he was gonna be this secretary.
Yeah, you're like asking the worst person in the world. You don't want me to be the secretary.
Okay, does anyone want to volunteer? If not, we will choose from those who have not done it so far.
It's kind of
Okay.
exciting to do it.
I wanna ask.
It's kind of exciting. I love that.
To do it
That's
just
the
like.
best attitude.
I get the kid? Oh, good.
That's fantastic.
Don't think I'm anything wrong here. I'm a guess. You wouldn't do anything.
This says Beth.
Oh, is it
Lucky
here?
that.
I think she's going to be, but it hasn't arrived. As far as I know, she
She had this happen once.
Yeah, I thought she was
Gotta
coming this
happen.
week.
Is
3
everything?
times. Deborah.
Wait, in the
3
minutes
times.
that I read the minutes, it said somebody who wasn't at the last one but was chosen is gonna be the,
Oh, actually, that was,
Deb's
I read.
3
Yeah.
times.
that was Deb.
there you go, I didn't pick anybody else.
Oh,
Oh,
that's impressive.
yeah.
I
We approved the
really.
minutes.
I'm
We
glad I
approved the
captured
minutes
that.
too, right?
That is right. I forgot about
That's
that.
only notes, you have to trade me your notebook.
Someone read the minutes.
Good job, Kat. I'd forgotten about that.
Does anyone, do you have some paper that she can use?
Yes,
She didn't know she was our
Sure,
scribe.
Thank you very much.
okay.
Okay, so let's talk about,
Take notes, I'll give you a template.
after policy area 4, we go into policy area 5, which we know is going to be a biggie, and it talks about water. Let me make sure I have all the policy areas in front. And so I would like to recommend to everyone that we save the water discussion for once we have a little more detail from the water study that is happening as we speak. If we are talking about density and other things that hinge on what could come out of this water study, it could say you can put more in, it could say you can put less in, who knows? We have no idea. But that plus the previous data
Here's the list.
would probably help us in addressing policy area 5 and actually also policy area 6. So my recommendation would be that we move both of those to the very last. And then so after 4, then we go to 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then do 5 and 6. I want to see what everyone's thoughts are on that and have a discussion around that.
Can you say that again, please?
Okay.
Just do the numbers.
So 5 is water, and that's coming up in a meeting or two, depending on how far we get today and the next meeting.
Got that right.
And then after that is 6, which is housing and residential development. And both of those, we think, hinge on what we hear, A, from the water study, but B, from some of the experts we talked about in the last meeting coming in and giving us presentations. So I thought it would be good for us to have that kind of data before we go forward with those 2 policy areas. And move those to the very end. Does anyone want to have a discussion around that and talk about your thoughts?
Good idea. Good idea.
Sounds good.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but again, our job is to review the current development ordinance. And by waiting, this might add another variable that we shouldn't think about because the town hasn't adopted any or made any conclusions based upon that recommendation. So, I mean, maybe it makes sense, but our focus is on the current development, and until the town adopts different standards, we shouldn't make that kind of assumption for them. So.
Well, so that's a great point, but our task is the comprehensive plan to the current UDO. I don't think between now and then the UDO is going to change. We're still reviewing it to that, but we might have some different data clarity based on the recommendations from the comprehensive plan. That's all I'm saying. It might not have any sway. It might be exactly the same.
What do you mean by clarity? Because the comprehensive plan isn't changing.
Correct.
Clarity in the water study, the discussion of water recharge, and the relationship between groundwater supply and density.
Well, we have a 20-plus-year-old study too. That was focused on Guilford County, not just Summerfield. And this would maybe give some new data that could help us go forward.
Well,
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, well, and especially
If it
since-
doesn't, then we can still proceed and have our discussion. My only thought is we now could potentially have to go back again. Whereas if this is hot off the press and we get a presentation on it and learn a little bit more, it could help us.
The other part of it is because those are substantial topics, maybe we can get some momentum moving through the other policy areas, and then we'll know where we stand at the end as far as timing. And it gives us time to bring in some speakers to talk about.
Since the water is such an important topic and everybody's conveyed that at the table and in the public,
Yeah.
and that at least helps to know what the results are from that as we have those conversations around those 2 topics. I
And
would agree
the
with
comprehensive plan goes into some depth, but clarity is, I don't know if you can read the comprehensive plan and understand it fully. I don't expect that for you to be able to do that without some additional information.
It sounds good to me. I would like to have more information. So I don't have a problem with it. We're gonna do them all anyway. So I don't see where there's a problem with whether we do it first, second, third, fourth, fifth, or whatever. It's there.
Yeah, when I had the discussion, it's not putting it off, it's not
Right, yeah.
that we're not gonna do it, it was just trying to get more ducks in a row before we go discuss that
Yeah, because
policy.
we always have some things that we will be asking on those, on the 5 and 6, that maybe some of those questions that we may have, that we want to show doesn't fit with the UDO. It may be a better way for us to give us some clarity as far as that's concerned. as to what we are doing with each one of the policies as we're going down. So I don't have a problem with that.
And to Bob's point, when you look at the housing and residential development zoning districts and see the density and lot size requirements, and then you read the comprehensive plan and it talks about moderately priced housing and it talks about protecting our groundwater. So how can you possibly know what one does to the other without more information in this topic?
Well, and in reality, in the past 20 years, there've been a lot of changes in science and engineering in terms of water systems, septic systems, and building systems and so forth, all of which could impact how we view and the lens through which we view the language in the comprehensive plan relative to the UDO.
Yeah, to me, I mean, water was our number one
Yeah, it was.
theme
Water
for this group. And
Yeah.
so if we can get more data to support us going forward, that was my thought. It wasn't anything else.
I don't know which way. Groundwater, updated groundwater, more site-specific for our area. The science is still the same from that 1996 study. The numbers are still the same, but the assumptions were based on regional data. There were a lot of assumptions based on how each lot behaves. It may be that 0.73 units an acre is not low density enough for some areas. How do we know which answer it is? I mean, I'm serious. When you look at each site, that just one simple number isn't enough. So.
And my understanding is they still stand by their study, is that correct?
Yes, and the science is correct. I've read it and I understand it, and I've gone through the math, and I've seen some, and hopefully we can get someone to go over that with you when the time comes.
So-
Is how these formulas come up with average, and there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of how big does one lot need to be to satisfy its groundwater needs. It doesn't take into account the holistic development. And it doesn't take into account really specific infiltration capabilities of those soils. It talks about regional assumptions.
So Carrie, the fact that in that study, they assumed that water used by a house then disappeared.
That's correct. That
See,
was one of the,
it
that
was
was one of the elements.
so you say it's a valid study, and
Well,
my
the
husband says
science
it's
is
flawed.
valid.
Well, and people make assumptions, and they can be challenged.
Yeah,
So this is my worry, is that we all of a sudden become a water board.
gotcha,
And
gotcha.
I think it's
That's why I wanted to
fine,
refocus.
it's fine for us to rearrange the order, and it may be that our recommendation is to take the new data into consideration. That may be our
Good.
recommendation,
Yeah,
but I don't want
that's
us to say, I suggest it should be 0.62 or 0.82 or something.
Yeah.
Well, but your point, 20 years is a long time. That's a 20-year-old study.
So it
It's a
would
long
inform
time.
you enough to say, we can't really make a call about this
Well,
density.
recommendations may change based on the information that's new, but I totally agree with Bob.
Yeah.
The key here is
That
what
part
would it,
there and what, I mean, I'm not an expert in that, I don't want to even touch it, but I
No.
think our recommendations could potentially change by what comes back.
Let's just have be as smart as we can.
the key here is,
What did you say? Oh, am I supposed to?
will it hurt? Will it hurt what we're doing to delay those two topics to the end? Is there any adverse reaction that could happen by doing that?
As long as we don't get into the weeds. with
Are
it.
there any positives that could come out of putting those two at the end?
So the only comment I would make, and it's maybe if there's a negative, it's making sure that we're not saying we're gonna wait until that study comes out. We're assuming it's gonna come out by the time we get there. If it is not out by
We
that
move
time,
forward.
then we go with what we
Good
have.
point.
Right,
Good
Right,
point.
we're not saying we're
Excellent.
waiting for that
Please
to come out
capture
in
that,
2 years.
because that is
Right,
very
yeah.
important.
It's
We are not gonna wait.
It's due in February.
Right,
Okay,
so the
that's
timing
good
feels
point.
right, but if
Yeah.
it was to get delayed, we're not saying delay that.
If it was due in
just
June,
Oh.
that recommendation wouldn't be on the table right now.
Yeah,
Amen.
yeah. No, we're not gonna wait forever.
You're not wrong.
That came out right.
Okay,
The other piece of the expert, sorry, Andrew, to interrupt, is on the housing and residential development side, is where, as Jesse mentioned the last time, looking for, Bill, can you speak to the kind of expert that we're
We're
looking for?
thinking that, and I think that this came up maybe, back in early October, that the desire to have some new data on housing market trends, housing market projections for Summerfield in the context of Guilford County and maybe the wider region. My colleagues at Piedmont Tribe Regional Council are looking at some people who can bring that data expertise. We're considering people from the Greater Greensboro Board of Realtors or home builders. Marlene Sanford at Trabic, an industry trade group, has a lot of data available. So if there's agreement on moving the housing and residential development policy area discussion till, say, February, we can proceed ahead and make an invitation, and they can prepare the data and prepare for presentation. If you remember the earlier schedule that you're operating on now, I think we had projected maybe 2 meetings for housing and residential. It's very, there's a lot in the policies and there's a lot in the UDO. So I think if you, whenever that meeting is scheduled, if you wanted, we can have somebody with some data on trends at the beginning as you get into your discussion.
Well, if we,
I think Bill will revise the schedule. And I'll send it back out.
so that would be the thought. Can we get a motion to move those 2 to the end?
I second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay. So we will move those 2 to the end. Okay, but it is all yours for policy area 2 wrap up. Draft wrap up. Draft wrap up.
Okay, you'll recall that at the November 2 meeting, you completed your review of the recommendations, draft recommendations in policy area 2. I think made pretty good progress as the meeting went on. But we've established call it protocol, to then have all members have one more opportunity to look at that collection of recommendations. And if anybody in the past 2 weeks has had a sense that a recommendation needs to be some additional adjustment to the language, this is an opportunity to bring that up. And just again, this is repeating what I think we've said and understand. Whatever action you take tonight on these, you're approving them in draft form. You'll revisit in March and have another chance to re-review after you've gone through all policy areas. So I don't, let me ask first, rather than going through recommendation by recommendation, if anybody on re-reviewing what you did last meeting have any concerns or any additional comments or the need for additional adjustments to these recommendations?
On the first one, I would like to say that we should require rather than include opportunities. Because you gotta start somewhere with sidewalks and connectivity. I noticed in Oak Ridge the other day, there is a sidewalk that started at the Commons, and it's now goes past the swimming club. and it stops, but you know someday forward, it will go somewhere else. And you don't start somewhere else. Don't ever do that.
Do you have suggested changes to the language that's on that's there?
Instead of saying include opportunities, require connectivity.
Okay.
Instead of include opportunities.
That's my thought.
I would agree with that. That would be my thought.
So the revised language, is your suggestion to
Take
drop
off the
include opportunities too and start that recommendation with
connectivity.
Oh, excuse me.
require connectivity and require easements and stubs to reserve the alignment whenever sidewalks are included in the UDO, require all non-vehicular transportation, da-da-da-da. So instead of include opportunities, you'd start with the verb require.
So maybe as a point of clarification in the planning word speak, what does include opportunities mean, Carrie? And
It means, look for various ways to require it, either when a site plan is being proposed at a zoning, stage. It's looking for tools and mechanisms through which to require them. Is it creating language that requires at least an easement to be dedicated for a future sidewalk? That's the opportunity, and I will still take it that way. It's a requirement, and I'll look for different ways to require it.
Is there any other comment on that proposed change to this recommendation?
Get rid of that second require.
Could you just enlarge it? I mean, I don't know if you can.
Sure, no, you can.
Yeah, enlarge the
I just made it
font
smaller.
size.
you can't see that over there? Can't
How
believe it.
about enlarge the font size?
That's better.
Were there,
Yay, thank you.
okay,
Well,
there you
I was trying to
Good.
avoid now that we're in policy,
Good.
that policy will.
go. Well, I'm closer to it, so I can see it too. Does anybody have any other of this set of recommendations that you would like to be either adjusted or some altered language that you would suggest?
If you're just gonna require the easement, you should require grading as well.
I didn't hear what you said, I'm sorry.
Grading,
Grading?
grading.
Okay, Mark?
So let's see.
So what does that mean? If you wanted to put a sidewalk in, it would already be ready to go?
Yeah, so, if you don't, I mean, unless you know, I mean, sometimes it's just really easy to look at, but I mean, grading costs money, leveling it all out, so you can go in there and put it all down. And if you don't look at the site and there's some kind of, I mean, it could just be a 16-foot gap where the land drops off at a grade that's just gonna cost you a whole lot of money to bring back up. Well, they give you an easement, and maybe they pay you just for the sidewalk construction, but then when you get in there, you say, I have an easement, I got the money for the concrete, but I don't have any money for this land to bring it up, and it also drops down in some wetland, and I gotta get permits for that. And it just, if they're just gonna leave it where they're just gonna pay you for it and leave you an easement, then they should grade it for you too. And because also you come in there later and you start doing that grading work, and you find out you need to get on their property that's not within the easement, well, then they may say, oh, no, that's my private property, that's outside of your easement, you can't get into that. And you say, well, I have to in order to level the ground. So they just prep the ground.
That was what some of the opportunities were, because we could also require sureties
Yeah,
for
however.
future site prep.
Is that preferable to what Carolyn was saying about just having them build it, even though it stubs to nothing?
I honestly think it should be open enough to be determined site by site.
Are there, looking at that language for this particular recommendation, any further suggestions on it that would improve it?
Requiring it site by site is gonna get a little difficult, especially as we get into the next and to number 4, where you're talking a lot about pedestrian connections. Building code will require each site to have a public to private connection. And that's a connection from the building entrance exit out to the public right of way. And so it'll be a path out there, a pedestrian path. And they'll bring it out and they'll just stub it right at the property line unless you have a sidewalk there. And so a way to get around, not around that, but an alternate method is an area of safe dispersal, or basically they'll route you out to another lot, an area on the site where people can go off to, and that meets that requirement. So if we're concerned about having pedestrian connections, then you really should start enforcing it, especially around here, because where we have no network and where it's going to be harder to get that network because we don't have curb and gutter, which means that sidewalk's going to be pushed further into their site because they'll have to put it on the other side of their ditch. And so it's going to present more and more obstacles for people to say it's not going to work for my site. And then if we're concerned about having pedestrians, I mean, the pedestrians have to come from somewhere. If they're if you want connections if you want pedestrian connections into sites, the pedestrians have to walk along the street for a certain amount of time to then access your site. And if there's no sidewalk network there, then there's not going to be any pedestrians.
I thought the site by site, we were just talking about easement versus building of the sidewalk. Are you advocating building the sidewalk?
I mean, sidewalk should just be a requirement, and then if they have some reason why sidewalk cannot be installed because of whatever, then you start working with them to discover why it just won't be installed. I mean, if you want pedestrian connections, then it should just be a requirement.
Is there any further discussion about this one? Are there any other recommendations that you reviewed last meeting that you would like to revisit or have some additional language changes?
To Ryan's question, are you suggesting we should require connectivity and not easements?
I think we're in the wrong area, by the way. This is about making sure that bikes are included where there's pedestrian.
See,
That's this area, about making sure that all modes are considered. There's another comment.
Unless you require right-of-way dedication, I think easements are going to apply in all cases, because you're never going to be able to put, usually the public right-of-way along streets is, you'll see the utilities out there, and that's kind of your line where the public right-of-way is, and
6 to 9 feet.
And sometimes there's easements for those too. I mean, Summerfield's, I don't know what Summerfield's lots look like. I haven't seen a whole lot of them as far as people bringing in plans, but I'm just saying, oftentimes when I get sidewalk on plans, it's in the public right of way because I have curb and gutter, and so I have curb and gutter, a 3-foot to 5-foot grass strip, and then 5 feet of sidewalk. And that's all within the public right of way. And I can also ask for right of way dedication. But if you don't do that, it's going to push it on the other side of that ditch. And if you're not requiring right of way, that right of way is going to be on the other side of the ditch. The sidewalk's going to be on private property, and so you're going to have to ask for a public access easement over top of that sidewalk in all cases. Or it's going to be sidewalk on private property, which they can close off to the public should they choose, unless you have that easement. So in Summerfield, I think you're going to have easements on almost every lot, unless you require the right-of-way dedication to make them push that right-of-way to the other side of that sidewalk, which for ditch sections is going to require a pretty good right-of-way dedication.
So there's different methodologies, and those were what I meant by what was opportunities to require in all cases, require them, but there may be different methodologies for each.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways you can go about it, but
I wonder how rigid we want to be making a recommendation, because if you have a really nice farmland field that's part of the development, then we're going to be able to save that somehow where the developer would move things back, then you don't necessarily want to require a sidewalk on that frontage, right? So how are we
You know, if we want pedestrian connectivity, then it's part of, I mean, if you want it, then you gotta ask for it. If you don't want it, then,
The thing about it is, and obviously Ryan has a lot more knowledge than I do. I would also think that with each site, you're gonna figure out something, so if it's in front, on the frontage, so to speak, you can have different ways of creating that connectivity, as she's saying, she's looking for opportunities. And I think right now, it seems so different because it's not what we know or see, but it's out there. So in neighborhoods or communities where you have it as a part of life, then it's just a part of what is, everybody knows and sees.
Right, so requiring that connectivity and the easements and
Yeah.
prep work doesn't necessarily mean frontage, it means somewhere in the lot.
That's what I would think. I mean, I think you can't, it's, I know, I think that's why Karen was saying what she's saying, but I think to have the conversation so that it gets started, that we start to create that community of connectivity, you know, and then you just have to.
I'm sorry that I can't bring it up, but I was trying to give you an example of one that I just required today, a sidewalk connection for a property, and it was based on its proximity to the Vineyard Trail and to the AY Greenway and to 220, and two properties alongside it. And I was gonna try to bring it up visually, but I'm having a hard time bringing it up the map, but.
I think that's the point, and I think isn't that what you're saying too, is like creating those opportunities,
And
where you
those-
see those opportunities, you're requiring them.
Mhm.
That doesn't necessarily mean a sidewalk next to the road.
That's right, that's
Because
exactly
I
right.
think that's unrealistic, to think
Right,
we're just gonna
absolutely.
sidewalk all of Summerfield, I mean, that's.
So.
This is only new also, right?
Right,
Well, this
That was
policy
new.
2.1
Right.
New
is sidewalks,
development.
bike racing, and trails.
right.
But then to Ryan's point, because I do think Summerfield Road would be a great road to sidewalk. So it's existing homes, so I don't know what language that becomes, and that would be a sidewalk next to a road. But and my thought would be, going to the comp plan, it's what it says to do, and eventually if you encourage that, you might get businesses that you can bike to, you know, and economically, yes, it costs money to put in bike routes, but there's also economic savings, and there's also business development and money that comes into business owners when you create that kind of environment. And so if we wanted to eventually encourage owners to buy those little houses and maybe do a coffee shop or a little restaurant or something like that, to create that walking and walkability would be wonderful.
I mean, Summerfield Road is feasible.
Yes, absolutely.
150, Scalesville,
No, I'm not walking there
Pleasant
either.
Ridge, I mean, there's just not.
And
No.
at this point, just saying required sends the message to the zoning board, Kathy, that this means we are to write ordinance that requires sidewalks. And then the methodologies for that, we can talk about later. And I think Ryan will be a big help in that. But that, I think maybe we're getting a little bit too
Yeah,
deep into it.
I do agree.
The idea is that we
Is
want to
there-
require it, we really